parlour of Ravenscroft Estate was a cage of gold and glass, designed to make the small feel infinitesimal. Lady Beatrice Ravenshire sat enthroned in a gilded armchair, the silk of her midnight blue gown hissing like a serpent as she adjusted her posture. She did not look at Eleanor Whitmore with eyes. She looked at her through a gold-handled lorgnette, the magnifying glass transforming Eleanor into a specimen, a curious, unwanted insect caught in the wrong garden. "You have a certain rustic charm, Miss Whitmore," Beatrice remarked, her voice as thin and sharp as a silver needle. She tapped the lorgnette against her chin, the rhythmic click-clack echoing the frantic beating of Eleanor's heart. "But charm is a seasonal thing. It withers when the frost of reality hits. My son, the Duke, is currently blinded by the summer sun. He thinks he sees a diamond. I, however, see the pebble." Eleanor stood perfectly still. Her cream-colored muslin dress, though clean and pressed, felt like a shroud of poverty against the suffocating opulence of the room. She did not lower her head. She kept her gaze steady, a magnetic dignity radiating from her that made Beatrice's lips curl in icy curiosity. "I am not a diamond, Your Grace," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but unbroken, "but I am not for sale." Beatrice laughed, a dry, brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. She reached for the tea service, the porcelain clinking with a finality that signaled the end of the game. With a flick of her wrist, she slid a cream-colored envelope across the mahogany table. It sat there, a heavy, silent insult between them. "Inside is a bank draft for £500 and a carriage ticket to the northern counties," Beatrice said, leaning back into the shadows of her chair. "It is a fortune for a rector's daughter. It is the price of your disappearance. If you stay, I will strip Lucian of his title before I let him hand it to a commoner. I will burn his future to ash, and he will learn to hate the sight of your face because it will be the face of his ruin." The lorgnette came up again, the lorgnette lash striking as Beatrice peered through the lens at Eleanor's trembling hands. "Find someone your level, Miss Whitmore. Be a sensible girl and roll back into the garden where you belong." The silence in the parlour grew heavy, thick with the scent of bergamot and the stench of social execution. Eleanor looked at the envelope, the price of disappearance, and then at the doors where she knew Lucian was currently riding toward her, a man who loved her with an intensity that terrified his mother. She realized then that to save the Duke, the pebble had to roll away. With a hand that felt disconnected from her body, Eleanor reached out and took the envelope. She didn't cry, she didn't beg. She simply executed a curtsy so perfect, so precise, it was an act of war. "I hope the view from your level is worth the silence, Your Grace," Eleanor whispered. She turned and walked out of the gilded cage, the heavy oak doors closing behind her with a thud that sounded like the lid of a casket. Outside, the sky was bruising into a storm, the first drops of rain washing away the summer romance, and beginning the long, cold exile of the woman the Duke would soon cross 3 counties to find. The rain began as a soft weeping against the thatched roof of the rectory, a sombre accompaniment to the frantic packing of a life reduced to a single trunk. Eleanor moved through her small bedchamber like a ghost, already haunting her own home. Every object she touched was a jagged fragment of a world she was no longer permitted to inhabit. A dried larkspur from their first walk in the meadows, a ribbon he had teased from her hair, and the crushing weight of the envelope tucked into her bodice. She sat at her father's scarred writing desk, the inkwell staring back at her like a dark, accusing eye. Her hands, usually so steady when mending linens or pouring tea, shook with a violent, rhythmic tremor. She had to tell him. Even if the truth was a poison, she could not let Lucian believe she had simply vanished for the sake of gold. "My dearest Lucian," she began, the nib of the pen scratching a desperate path across the parchment. "Your mother has shown me the horizon, and I am not in it. She holds your future like a glass ornament, ready to shatter it if I remain. Do not look for me. To love you is to leave you, for I will not be the weight that pulls a duke into the mire." She poured her soul into the ink, the scent of the hayloft where they had shared their first kiss, the way his eyes turned the color of a stormy sea when he spoke of his dreams, and the agonizing truth that her heart would never find its level elsewhere. When she finished, she pressed her lips to the paper, leaving a ghost of a kiss on the cooling wax. A sharp, rhythmic rapping at the rectory door broke the silence. It wasn't the frantic, joyful knock of a lover, it was the measured, hollow sound of a servant. Eleanor opened the door to find Mr. Henderson, Lady Beatrice's grim-faced steward, standing in the downpour. He did not offer an umbrella. He simply held out a hand for the letter he knew she would have written. "Her Grace anticipated you might wish to leave a farewell, Miss Whitmore," Henderson said, his voice as mechanical as the carriage wheels waiting at the gate. Eleanor looked at the letter in her hand, then at the man who served the woman who had just dismantled her life. She knew with a soul-deep certainty that this letter would never reach the Duke's hands. It would be read by Beatrice, mocked for its sentimentality, and then consigned to the library fireplace until it was nothing but grey flakes and forgotten promises. It was a secondary execution. "Tell her," Eleanor whispered, her voice hardening as she handed over the parchment, "that she may burn the words, but she cannot burn the memory of why they were written." The steward offered no reply, pocketing the letter with a practiced indifference that chilled Eleanor more than the night air. He gestured toward the waiting black carriage, a shadow against the rain-slicked road. Eleanor took one last look at the village of her birth, at the distant silhouette of Ravenscroft Estate perched on the hill like a predator. She climbed into the dark interior of the coach, the door clicking shut with the same finality as Beatrice's lorgnette. As the horses lurched forward, beginning the journey that would take her across 3 counties into a cold, ink-stained exile, Eleanor pressed her hand against the glass. She was leaving behind her name, her heart, and her hope, all because she had been told to find her level in the dark. The transition from the daughter of a rector to a woman who scrubbed her own floors was not a descent, but a hardening. 2 years had passed since the black carriage had dropped Eleanor in the salt-strung air of a coastal county, 3 borders away from the green hills of her youth. In the village of Oakhaven, she was no longer the girl who had danced in the shadow of a duke. She was simply Miss Whitmore, the schoolmistress with the ink-stained fingers and the eyes that seemed to look through stone. The schoolhouse was a drafty building of grey flint, where the wind whistled through the floorboards like a restless spirit. Eleanor's life was now measured in the scrape of chalk against slate and the rhythmic thud-thud of her broom against the hearth. Her hands, once soft enough to be held in Lucian's calloused palms, were now mapped with the scars of survival, chapped by lie and stained by the permanent indigo of the fountain pen. Yet even as she knelt to scrub the mud of 30 children from the floorboards, she wore her frayed muslin dress with a magnetic dignity that silenced the local gossips. The village elders had initially viewed her with suspicion, a lone woman from the south with the speech of a lady and the pockets of a pauper. They expected her to break, to weep, or to flee. Instead, they found a woman who could stare down the most unruly blacksmith's son with a single, steady gaze that felt strangely regal. She did not ask for pity. She commanded a quiet, fearful respect. "She has the spine of a cathedral," the local baker would mutter, watching Eleanor walk to the market. She never looked down at the cobblestones. She walked as if she were still navigating the gilded halls of Ravenscroft, her head held high enough to catch the light, even when the salt mist tried to swallow her whole. At night, when the children were gone and the fire dwindled to embers, Eleanor sat at her small, scarred desk. The world thought her solitary, but she lived in a crowded silence. She could still hear the ghost of Lady Beatrice's laugh in the wind and the phantom heat of Lucian's hand on her waist. On her desk sat the only thing she had saved from the lorgnette lash, a small, locked wooden box. Inside, hidden beneath a pile of corrected essays, lay the letter she had never sent, a second draft written in the dark of her first year in exile. It was sealed with a remnant of Ravenscroft wax she had scavenged from an old invitation, a ducal red anchor that tethered her to a life she was supposed to have forgotten. She was the pebble now, tucked away in the rough silt of a distant county, just as Beatrice had commanded. She had found her level among the chalk dust and the cold sea air. She had become a fixture of Oakhaven, as sturdy and silent as the cliffs. But as she pressed her ink-stained thumb against the red wax seal each night, Eleanor knew that while the Duchess had bought her silence, she had never truly bought her soul. The silence was not a surrender. It was a long, slow-burning fuse, waiting for the spark of a man who refused to believe a pebble could ever truly be lost. While Eleanor was hardening into a woman of flint and salt, the air back at Ravenscroft Estate had grown stagnant, thick with the silence of a tomb. Duke Lucian Ravenscroft moved through his ancestral halls like a man navigating a dream he couldn't wake from. 2 years of hollow duty had carved hollows into his cheeks, and the light that once burned in his eyes, the light Eleanor had ignited, was now a cold, flickering amber. He had been told she had taken the money and run. He had been told she was a seasonal creature, a girl who chose a comfortable purse over a difficult love. The truth, however, had a way of haunting the ledgers. It happened on a Tuesday, a day of grey drizzle that mirrored the internal weather of the Duke's soul. Lucian was sequestered in the library, a room of dark mahogany and leather-bound secrets, conducting an audit of the estate's discretionary funds. It was a tedious task, one usually left to the steward, but Lucian sought the distraction of numbers. They were cold, logical, and unlike his memories, they didn't bleed. He flicked through the pages of the 1824 ledger, his finger tracing the lines of grain exports and roof repairs, until he reached a section marked Miscellaneous Settlements. There, buried beneath a list of pension payments and stable upgrades, was a line of copperplate handwriting that made the blood in his veins turn to ice. October 14th, Whitmore Settlement, £500. The ledger seemed to pulse under his hand. A settlement was a word for a business transaction, a legal clearing of debt. It was not a word for a girl who had purportedly left him a letter of cold rejection. Lucian felt a sudden, sharp pressure in his chest, as if a physical weight had shifted. He turned the page, his breath coming in shallow hitches, and found the corresponding receipt tucked into the binding. It was a copy of the bank draft, signed with his mother's elegant, aggressive flourish. The date was the exact morning Eleanor had disappeared. "A pebble in a crown of diamonds," he whispered, the memory of his mother's favorite insult echoing in the quiet room. The betrayal didn't arrive as a scream, it arrived as a terrifying, focused clarity. He hadn't lost her to her own greed, he had lost her to his mother's malice. Eleanor hadn't found her level, she had been pushed to it. The Whitmore settlement wasn't a bribe Eleanor had sought, it was the price of her silence, a ransom paid by a duchess to steal the heart of a duke. Lucian looked at the ledger, at the ink that represented the murder of his happiness, and felt a 2-year-old wall within him crumble. The ghost of Eleanor wasn't in this room, but her scent, wildflowers and old books, suddenly filled his senses. He didn't pull the bell for his valet, he didn't send for his mother, he simply closed the ledger with a sound like a gunshot. He walked to the window, watching the rain lash against the glass, looking toward the borders of the county. He had no map of where she had gone, only the knowledge of what had been done. His mother had said Eleanor was a pebble. She had forgotten that a pebble, when thrown with enough force, can shatter the most expensive glass. "I am coming for you, Eleanor," he breathed against the cold pain, "and I don't care how many counties I have to burn to find you." He turned from the window, the urgent intensity of the man Eleanor loved returning to his face. The audit was over. The hunt had begun. The storm that broke over the Ravenscroft estate was not a weather event. It was a reckoning. Lucian did not wait for a carriage, nor did he pack a trunk. He swung onto his black stallion, a beast as restless as its master's soul, and rode into a wall of water that seemed intent on washing the very roads away. Every strike of the horse's hooves against the churning mud sounded a name he had been forbidden to speak for 730 days. Eleanor, Eleanor, Eleanor. By the time he crossed the border into the second county, the fine wool of his riding coat was a sodden weight, dragging at his shoulders like the expectations of his bloodline. The rain was cold, but the fire in his chest was a white-hot coal. As he pushed the horse through swollen streams and over treacherous, rain-slicked ridges, his mother's voice haunted the rhythm of the ride. "Find someone your level, Lucian. A duke does not stoop to the dirt." The level his mother demanded was a stagnant pond of highborn tea parties and bloodless alliances. It was a world of lorgnettes and ledgers, where people were moved like chess pieces across a mahogany board. Lucian leaned low over the stallion's neck, his face splattered with grit and rain, a wild, urgent intensity in his eyes that would have terrified the socialites of London. If this was what stooping felt like, this raw, desperate pursuit of a woman worth more than the crown jewels, then he would crawl through every inch of the English mud to reach her. He realized now that he had been the one on the lower level. He had been a puppet of tradition, a man who let a piece of parchment and a mother's shadow dictate the boundaries of his heart. Elena had stood in that parlor with nothing but a muslin dress and her pride, and she had outclassed the Duchess with a single look. She was the one who had been high above them all, and he had been too blind to see that her level was one of spirit, not of silver. The third county greeted him with a brutal, salt-heavy gale as he neared the coast. His muscles screamed with exhaustion, and the stallion's breath came in ragged plumes of steam, but Lucian did not slow. He stopped only once, at a crossroads inn, not to rest, but to demand the direction of every schoolhouse within 20 miles. The innkeeper stared at the mud-caked apparition, a duke who looked like a highwayman, and pointed toward the grey cliffs of Oakhaven. "The roads are washed out, my lord," the man shouted over the wind. "No sane man travels tonight." "Then it is a good thing I am no longer sane," Lucian barked, wheeling his horse back into the darkness. He rode on, his mind a feverish blur of memories, the way Elena's hair caught the golden hour light, the scent of the larkspur, and the quiet, magnetic dignity he had allowed to slip through his fingers. The 3 counties he crossed were more than just geography, they were the layers of a life he was shedding. With every mile of mud and every lash of rain, the Duke of Ravenscroft was dying, and the man who loved Eleanor Whitmore was finally, violently, coming home. The salt mist of Oakhaven was a poor substitute for the incense and wax of the south, but for Elena, it was the smell of a hard-won peace. She stood at the front of her classroom, her fingers dusted with white chalk, watching her pupils scramble into the afternoon fog. She was reaching for her broom to begin the daily ritual of clearing the grit from the floorboards when a sound stopped her heart, the heavy, rhythmic thud of a high-sprung carriage slowing to a halt outside. It was a sound that didn't belong in this village of fishermen and flint. The door to the schoolhouse didn't creak, it surrendered. Lady Beatrice Ravenshire stepped over the threshold, her presence a violent intrusion of violet velvet and cold authority. She did not speak at first. She simply raised her lorgnette, her icy curiosity sweeping over the peeling plaster, the crude wooden benches, and finally, Elena herself. "It seems you have truly found your level, Miss Whitmore," Beatrice remarked, her voice cutting through the damp air like a winter frost. "A drafty room, the smell of wet wool, and the company of peasants. It is almost poetic in its misery." Elena gripped the handle of her broom, her magnetic dignity acting as a shield. She did not curtsy this time. She stood tall, the indigo ink on her fingers, a badge of a life the Duchess could not understand. "I am at peace here, Your Grace, or I was, until the air grew foul with your arrival." Beatrice's lips thinned, her expression one of shocked, predatory amusement. "Peace is a fragile thing. My son has become restless. He has developed a sudden, unseemly interest in the estate ledgers. He is currently tearing across the countryside like a common stable boy in search of a lost hound." She stepped closer, the scent of her expensive French perfume clashing with the salt air. "I will not have him find you. I will not have the Ravenscroft name dragged through the mud of Oakhaven." From her silk reticule, Beatrice produced a second envelope, thicker and heavier than the first. She placed it on a student's scarred desk, right next to a pile of messy sums. £2,000, Miss Whitmore, and passage to the colonies, New York perhaps, a place where a woman of your resilience might start a school of her own and find a husband who doesn't require a pedigree. Elena looked at the envelope, the second price of disappearance, and then at the woman who saw human souls as items to be balanced in an audit. "You are terrified," Elena said softly, realization dawning like a cold sun. "You didn't come here to save Lucian from me. You came here because you realized you've already lost him. You're trying to buy back a ghost." "I am trying to preserve an empire," Beatrice hissed, her composure finally fracturing. "Take the money, Elena. Disappear across the ocean before he reaches this door. If he finds you here in this squalor, he will only hate you for what you've become. Save him that disappointment." The wind rattled the flint walls, and for a moment, the two women stood in a V-shaped deadlock, the established power of a dying world against the defiant innocence of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Elena reached for the envelope, her hand steady, but she did not tuck it away. She held it over the dying embers of the schoolhouse hearth, her eyes never leaving the Duchess's face. "He isn't looking for a duchess, Beatrice," Elena whispered. "He's looking for the truth, and that is something you can't afford." The envelope remained poised over the glowing embers, the heat of the fire licking at the heavy parchment. Elena's gaze was a flint strike against the Duchess's frozen mask of authority. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hiss of the salt wind against the glass, a low moan that seemed to mock the 2,000 pounds resting in Elena's hand. "Sign the declaration of departure, Eleanor," Beatrice commanded, her voice trembling with a rare, jagged edge of desperation. She thrust a legal document onto the scarred desk, a silver pen glinting beside it. "Sign it, take the fortune, and let this be the end of your common little tragedy." Eleanor looked down at the paper. It was a formal confession of greed, a document designed to prove to Lucian that she had never loved him, only the price of her own absence. She felt the martyr complex that had governed her for 2 years begin to buckle. To sign was to protect Lucian from his mother's wrath. To refuse was to invite a war she was ill-equipped to fight. Her fingers brushed the silver pen, the cool metal a stark contrast to the fire's heat. Then the world shattered. The schoolhouse door didn't just open, it exploded inward, the heavy oak groaning as it struck the flint wall. A gust of freezing rain and the scent of exhausted horseflesh flooded the room, extinguishing the candles and leaving only the orange glow of the hearth. Lucian stood in the threshold, a silhouette of urgent intensity. He was unrecognizable as the polished Duke of the Ravenscroft parlor. His riding coat was shredded and caked in the mud of 3 counties. His hair was plastered to a forehead marked by a blooming bruise from a fall. His boots were ruined. But as he stepped into the light, his eyes found Eleanor with a predatory, soul-deep recognition that made the Duchess's presence vanish into the shadows. "Lucian," Beatrice gasped, her lorgnette falling to the floor with a pathetic musical clink. She moved to intercept him, her violet velvet skirts swishing in a frantic attempt to regain the hierarchy. "You are unwell. This commoner has lured you into a fever. Step away from her at once." Lucian didn't even look at his mother. He didn't acknowledge the woman who had ruled his life since his first breath. He walked past her as if she were a ghost, his focus locked entirely on Eleanor and the envelope she held. "Drop it," he rasped, his voice raw from the wind and the miles. Eleanor stood frozen, the magnetic dignity she had worn as armor now dissolving into a trembling, human relief. "Lucian, you shouldn't have come. The storm." "I crossed the mud for a woman, not a shadow," he interrupted, stopping inches from her. He looked at the ink on her fingers, the fraying hem of her dress, and the defiant set of her shoulders. The hierarchy inversion was absolute. In this drafty schoolhouse, the Duke was the beggar, and the schoolmistress held the only currency that mattered. He reached out, his hand, shaking with exhaustion and rage, gently plucking the envelope from her grasp. Without a word, he tossed it into the center of the hearth. The 2,000 pounds ignited in a brilliant, hungry flash of blue and gold. "My mother thinks she knows your level, Eleanor," Lucian whispered, his gaze burning hotter than the burning bribe. "She forgot that I have spent 2 years sinking into the earth without you. I didn't come here to rescue you. I came to ask if I am finally worthy of standing beside you." Behind them, Lady Beatrice stood in the ruins of her control, a silent spectator to the moment her empire of paper and pride turned to ash. The schoolhouse air was thick with the scent of ozone and charred paper, a battleground where the past and future collided in a triangle of jagged tension. Lady Beatrice stood near the shadows of the chalkboard, her hand trembling as she clutched her silk reticule. The firelight flickered across her face, turning her icy curiosity into a mask of skeletal horror. She looked at the smoldering remains of the bribe in the hearth, then at her son, who stood before her like a man resurrected from the grave. "Look at yourself, Lucian," Beatrice hissed, her voice a whip crack in the silence. "You have become a creature of the gutter. You have abandoned your seat, your title, and your sanity for a girl who was happy to sell you for 500 pounds. She took the gold. She left you without a backward glance. Do you think a few stains of ink changed the soul of a social climber?" Lucian turned toward his mother, his urgent intensity radiating from him like heat from a forge. He didn't flinch at her words. He seemed to absorb them, his posture straightening as he stepped into the light. "She didn't take the gold to save herself, Mother. She took it to save me. I found the ledger. I found the settlement you buried beneath your lies." He stepped closer, the mud from his boots staining the floor Eleanor had scrubbed. "You used my name as a threat. You told her you would ruin me. You made her love for me a weapon to use against her, and for that, I will never forgive you." Elena moved then, stepping between the two Ravenscrofts. The hierarchy inversion was complete. She no longer looked like a victim awaiting judgment, but the arbiter of the room. "Enough," she said, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the Duchess's venom. "Your Grace, you spoke of levels. You told me to find mine in the garden or the dark. But look at where we are. You are standing in a schoolhouse in a village you wouldn't mark on a map, pleading for a control you've already lost." And Lucian, she turned to him, her steady eye contact drawing him into the center of the conflict. "You crossed 3 counties to find a girl who died the night she left Ravenscroft. I am not the pebble you lost. I am the woman who built a life out of the dust you left me in." "You see," Beatrice cried, a desperate triumph flickering in her eyes. "She rejects you. She has no heart left for you, Lucian. Come home. Let us forget this madness and restore the order of things." "The order is dead, mother," Lucian replied, his gaze never leaving Elena's. "You see a schoolmistress in a frayed dress. I see the only person in my life who was ever brave enough to tell me the truth. You spent my life teaching me that power is a matter of blood and bank drafts. Elena taught me that power is the ability to walk away from people like you." Beatrice's mouth parted, a shocked, silent gasp escaping her. The lorgnette she had used to judge the world lay broken at her feet, a symbol of her shattered vision. She looked at the two of them, the Duke caked in the earth and the girl stained with the ink, and realized that they were no longer playing her game. The three-way battle had ended not with a victory of rank, but with the total subversion of her rules. The midnight air was cold, but for the first time in 2 years, the suffocating weight of the Ravenscroft name had been lifted, leaving only the raw, honest silence of 3 souls standing on a level they finally shared. The fire in the hearth had settled into a low, pulsing amber, casting long shadows that stretched across the flint walls like the bars of a cage. Elena felt the weight of the 2 years she had carried, the silence, the labor, and the lingering shame of that first surrender, settle into a single sharp point of resolve. She walked slowly toward her desk, her footsteps the only sound in the room as the Duchess and the Duke watched her with bated breath. From the locked wooden box, she did not pull the letter she had never sent. Instead, she withdrew a yellowed, wax-sealed envelope that had lived under her floorboards and inside her bodice, a constant reminder of the day she had been told she had a price. She turned back to Lady Beatrice. The Duchess stood frozen, her midnight blue velvet gown appearing dull and dusty in the schoolhouse light. Elena did not look at Lucian. This was not for his benefit. This was for the girl who had stood trembling in a gilded parlor, believing that her heart was a debt to be settled. "You told me that I was a pebble, Your Grace," Elena said, her voice vibrating with a quiet, magnetic power. "You told me to roll back into the garden and stay there. You thought you bought my absence with this." She held up the original bank draft, the £500 that had been the architect of her exile. The paper was crinkled and worn, the ink of Beatrice's signature still mocking in its elegance. "I kept it," Elena continued, stepping toward the noblewoman until they were mere inches apart. "Not because I intended to spend it. I kept it because I needed to remember the exact cost of your soul. I worked until my hands bled so that I would never have to touch a penny of your blood money." With a flick of her wrist, Elena didn't hand the envelope over, she threw it. The price of disappearance struck the Duchess's silk-clad chest and fluttered to the floor, landing in the dirt and chalk dust at Beatrice's feet. "Take your settlement back to Ravenscroft," Elena whispered. "I am returning it in full. The interest I have paid in 2 years of silence is more than you can ever afford to repay me." Beatrice looked down at the envelope as if it were a poisonous viper. For the first time, the hierarchy inversion was absolute. The Duchess, surrounded by her wealth and her titles, looked small and hollowed out. She had come to Oakhaven to offer thousands, only to have her original 500 flung back at her as trash. Lucian stepped forward, placing a mud-stained hand on the back of a school bench for support. He looked at the envelope on the floor, then at Elena. The martyr complex that had driven her to leave him was gone, replaced by a radiant, terrifying agency. She hadn't just survived. She had triumphed over the very idea that she could be managed. "She is worth more than your entire estate, Mother," Lucian said, his voice thick with a proud, jagged wonder. "And she doesn't want a penny of it." Eleanor stood over the discarded bribe, her head held high, the indigo ink on her fingers, a mark of a wealth Beatrice would never understand. She had reclaimed her name. She had reclaimed her history. And as she looked at the broken woman before her, Eleanor knew that the pebble had finally finished its role, and it had landed exactly where it was meant to be. The silence that followed the clatter of the envelope was heavier than the storm outside. Lady Beatrice stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the dirt-streaked paper at her feet. In this humble room of flint and chalk, her presence had withered. The lorgnette was broken, the bribe was burned, and the son she had sought to save was looking at her with a pity that cut deeper than any insult. She was the mistress of a world that no longer had a hold on the two people standing before her. "Leave us, mother," Lucian said, his voice quiet and final. "The carriage is outside. Go back to the house of diamonds and shadows. We are finished with both." Beatrice did not argue. She did not even look up. She gathered her violet skirts, avoiding the touch of the common floor, and walked out into the night. The sound of her carriage retreating was swallowed by the roar of the sea, leaving the schoolhouse to the wind and the two souls who had survived her. Lucian turned to Eleanor. The urgent intensity had softened into something deeper, a magnetic reverence. He didn't offer her a throne or a title. He offered his hand, scarred by the rains and cold from the ride. "I have nothing but a horse and a name I intend to redefine," he whispered. "Will you leave this garden with me?" Eleanor looked at the room that had been her sanctuary and her prison. She picked up her cloak, her movements fluid and sure. "I am not leaving because a duke asked me, Lucian. I am leaving because I am finished being still." They stepped out of the schoolhouse, leaving the door swinging in the salt mist. Lucian helped her onto the black stallion, mounting behind her as if they were fleeing a burning city rather than a village. As they rode away, Eleanor looked back one last time. The schoolhouse stood dark and small against the cliffs, a place where a girl had died and a woman had been born. They did not head south toward the gilded gates of Ravenscroft. They turned west, toward the open horizon where the level was determined only by the height of their shared dreams. The ride was no longer a desperate chase. It was a journey toward a future built on mutual respect, where the only hierarchy was the one they created together. Behind them, the Duchess was left in the quiet, humble silence she had once despised, while ahead, the road was wide, muddy, and entirely theirs. If you enjoyed this journey of defiance and devotion, follow for more stories where love breaks every rule. What would you have done with the £500? Let us know in the comments.